Al's Moonlight Diner. Zack tore down the highway, fingers wrapped around the steering wheel of his Xterra, when he saw the faded diner sign that read Al's Moonlight Diner. Your dining destination, 10 miles ahead. The sign was half covered in creeping vegetation, and Zack wondered if the diner was still standing. He was famished, his head was pounding, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. He licked his cracked lips and looked in the rear view, then tilted the mirror as though it made any difference. There was nothing on either side of the highway and hadn't been for a while. Zack accelerated. The Xterra's right tire clipped a chunk of shale and sent it sailing through the air where it shattered against the sun-packed dirt. Nothing would stop him, not this time. Molly could cry all she wanted. It wasn't his fault what happened. They'd known one another a whole mess of years, since 6th grade in fact, which meant they always had something to say, even if they weren't talking. Molly looked sorta like a rabbit, at least when they were younger, but she'd grown prettier by the day. Even a little round, she looked great. At least Zack always thought so. And since no one knew him like Molly and probably never would, Zack never saw a reason to want anyone else. Except with anyone else, there might not be all the fighting, which had come to be as common as the cold. It wasn't the fights that hurt so much as their long-ass aftermaths, that silence that settled into every corner, threatening to last forever, even though you knew that wasn't possible. And it was so stupid. All it took to make things right was a simple, "I'm sorry," but when neither party was willing to bend, things ended up broken instead. She owed him an apology, and he wasn't going back without it. He'd dealt with a fair heaping of the shit the world had to dish: car accidents, fistfights, broken bones, fires and floods, and hell, even the one night in jail for drunk and disorderly. But the only thing that ever really pissed him off was the endless fighting. She owed him an apology, and Zack would be perfectly comfortable at his cousin's house until he got it. Thanks to the worldwide freaking web, a research assistant could work anywhere. Mr. Jenkins didn't care if Zack worked from a laptop in his basement or the Himalayas, so long as he wasn't late. And Zack was never late. It felt like he'd been driving forever with the nothing all around, but that was fine. He'd be willing to drive a forever and a half more if it meant a few more miles between him and Bugs Bitchy. Hell, he even liked cutting the nothing at 90 miles an hour. The Xterra could take it, took it well in fact. Sure, it rattled as soon as it hit 70, but that didn't bother him. Zack didn't miss civilization, but he might have if he'd been depending on it for radio, rather than trying to keep time with Eminem, rapping along to every song from his playlist. Suddenly, Zack had a weird realization. He hadn't seen a gas station in what seemed like forever. Not too hard to believe out in the middle of nowhere. However, he could swear he topped the tank at the last station, and the gauge was already dipping below a quarter tank. Usually, he came upon a gas station before the gauge reached the halfway point. Pants would definitely be meeting shit if he didn't find something soon. Zack picked up the phone from the passenger seat and looked at the screen. 1 bar and barely a charge. Shit. The charger was back home, if Molly hadn't lit it on fire, which she may very well have. There was a pregnant second of silence, then Eminem's daughter, Haley, chimed through the speakers, reminding Zack how her dad had gone crazy. Bonus weird. Not seeing any gas stations was odd enough, but now that he really thought about it, he hadn't seen much of anything at all. No farms, no churches, no diners, let alone Al's Moonlight Diner, which the sign had promised. Zack hadn't even seen another billboard in who knew how long. He moved his hand from the steering wheel to his right temple, rubbed it, then cranked the volume, driving for another 3.5 songs before the diner appeared in the distance. Ye freaking whore. Al's Moonlight Diner looked old and nearly as beat to shit as the faded billboard. Not that it mattered, probably meant the food was better. Some of the shiniest restaurants he'd ever been to served food that tasted like particle board, while the greasiest spoons were usually worth licking. Besides, all he wanted was a hamburger and fries. Maybe a Coke. Any diner in the world ought to be able to do that. Plus, they could show him to the nearest gas station if there wasn't one tucked behind the dive, which was at least a possibility. Zack floored the gas, a smile on his lips, then swung the Xterra into the diner's mostly empty dirt parking lot a minute later. Zack parked between a late 70s Olds and an even older Chevy Coupe, maybe a Malibu. He killed the engine and M along with it, then opened the Xterra door and dropped feet to the dirt. He was halfway to the diner's entrance when he realized he'd left his cell in the Xterra, so he doubled back, grabbing it from the passenger seat, then slammed the door and leaned against the car while checking to see if Molly had called to sing her sorry song. But there was no signal on the dying LCD. He slipped the phone into his pocket, figured to hell with her anyway, then headed toward the diner. Up close, the diner looked nothing like he expected. The piece of shit he'd seen from the side of the road looked almost fresh up close. No peeling paint, no fading signage, and not a single speck of age or rust on the metal frames holding the wide, spotless windows. Zach spent a half-second wondering how much the diner must have spent on the remodel before settling on the bigger, better question of why in the hell they would. Zach opened the glass door to a tinkling chime. The place looked even newer inside than it did outside, and it was packed with people, more than the mostly empty parking lot promised. Zach scanned the room. What is wrong with this place? These people look like they stepped out of some old TV show. The first guy to catch Zach's attention looked like Luke Skywalker's nerdy older brother. He sat at the bar with floppy blonde hair, thin lips, and a nose that was too wide for his face, yet not wide enough to adequately support his oversized glasses. His flowered shirt had at least 10 too many colors, though his denim vest mercifully smothered most of them. Beside him sat a tall blonde, maybe in her late 40s, with a splatter of freckles dark enough to notice across the room, and a shirt whose tint may have been the ugliest shade of orange he'd ever seen. Beyond freckles was an older man wearing a thick black beard marked with 2 matching grey stripes running from the corner of his mouth to his chin like some kind of skunk. He also wore a chambray-coloured shirt and a curious smirk fixed on Zach. The man stirred his oatmeal, his eyes unmoving. Zach nodded. The oatmeal man nodded back. "Need a place to sit?" a waitress hollered, walking towards Zach with 3 empty plates in one hand, 5 in the other, and an empty glass in the crook of her arm, the sort of glass that looked naked without a milkshake. "Anywhere you like, honey, just don't stand around too much longer. It's going to be counter or standing room only in just a few, soon as the lunch crowd hits." "Lunch crowd? From where?" "We're in bumfuck Egypt, population, you all." Zach made his way through the room to the far side of the diner, past the man still mindlessly stirring his oatmeal. Oatmeal man gave Zach another nod as he passed, but this time he added an afternoon in a voice that seemed friendly but cautious, the kind of voice you might hear in a busy but dangerous city. "Afternoon," Zach returned the nod, then slipped into the only empty booth in the diner. An older couple sat behind him, looking even older than they probably were in faded denim jackets and matching faded denim jeans. There was a young couple sitting side by side in the booth across from Zach, giving him an unimpeded view of their public affection. He thought of Molly. There was one good thing that came from the fighting, and that was the makeup sex. It was always hot and passionate, but not even the allure of great sex pushed him to surrender. Not this time. Over the speaker system, Crocodile Rock ended, and Elton John traded places with Jim Croce, who loudly warned the room about bad Leroy Brown. Figures the music would be as lame as this place looks. Zach took the phone from his pocket and tossed it on the table. Still no signal, but maybe he'd be able to pick up a faint one if he waited. At least now, if Molly called, he might see it on the screen. He felt suddenly parched, as if he'd gone a whole day without drinking. His throat was dry, and his eyes felt bigger. He licked his lips and looked for a waitress. 3 of them were flitting around the diner, all of them with full hands and fast-moving bodies. Zach caught Oatmeal Man staring. Instead of breaking his stare, he winked with a nod. Zach turned away. The older couple behind him sounded like they were in the middle of a political discussion, though their exchange made little sense to Zach. "These price controls are horse crap," the man said, "and so is the scarcity. There's no difference between old oil and new oil, except the price. They can print the ration stamps, but I won't use them." "You will, Harvey," the woman said, "and you'll wait in line just like everyone else." Ration stamps? That sounded an awful lot like the oil crisis his parents told him about a few years before he'd been born, back when they were living in Fremont. His dad drove an old Econoline, which must have had a hole in the tank the way he complained about the gas, both the prices and the waiting. Zach had suspected, and his mum had sort of confirmed, it had never really been that bad. "Where's the waitress?" "I am fucking thirsty." It was impossible not to notice the couple making out in front of him, grazing each other's cheeks, tickling earlobes with teeth, and trading quiet giggles. Zach was still mad at Molly, but watching the two of them made him miss her, threatening his resolve. An abrupt shadow crossed the girl's face, and her eyes flared, making her long, straight red hair look suddenly severe. The boy looked sorry, but Zach was fluent in the expression and knew the boy was only sorry he'd gotten caught. Not because of what he'd actually done. Zach leaned forward, trying to look like he wasn't listening, but not caring too much if he did. Discretion obviously wasn't high on their list. The argument was older than dirt, a version that had played out between him and Molly more times than he could count. It usually went something like, "What's the matter?" "You were looking at that woman." "What woman?" "Over there, the one with the big boobs and the small top." "No, I wasn't." "Yes, you were. I'm not stupid." "Okay, maybe I was, but it's not like I'm interested." "Then why were you looking?" "I wasn't. I was looking at something else." "Really? Well then, why don't you spend tonight looking at the couch?" Aerosmith's Dream On came on the radio. Great, finally something cool. He could dig this. Zach realized that despite his hunger, he hadn't even looked at the menu, so he opened it up to the usual breakfast fare: pancakes, waffles, assorted cheap meats, and unfertilized chicken fetuses. For some reason, nothing sounded good. Not even a burger, fries, and Coke. Oatmeal Man probably had it right. There were no prices on the menu, which Zach didn't like a bit. He hated asking the price even when he could afford it. But the prices couldn't be too bad. This place was at least 3 stars away from 5, though they could probably tack on a few extra dollars for being the only spot smack dab in the middle of who in the hell would want to live Heresville. Maybe that's what accounted for the lunch rush. After thinking he would gladly lick the back of a wet seal just to soften his tongue, Zach stood, marched to a waitress and said, "Can you please bring me a water when you get a moment?" "Of course," the waitress said, flashing Zach a pretty smile that made him think again of Molly. Zach sat back down and immediately felt eyes boring into his back. Certain it was Oatmeal Man. He wished he'd sat on the other side of the booth so he could keep an eye on the weirdo instead of feeling the guy creeping behind him. The waitress set a tall glass of water on the table, then laid a half-unwrapped straw beside it. "What can I get you?" she said, pad in hand and clear ballpoint pen at the ready. She was pretty, with full cheeks that fell just short of looking fat, and a round figure that fit her perfectly. Like Molly. "Just a bowl of oatmeal, please." The waitress raised an eyebrow. "Just a bowl of oatmeal?" Zach nodded. "That's it." "It's a long drive till the next stop," she said. "You sure a bowl of oatmeal's gonna be enough?" She smiled, teasing the edges of Zach's playful side. "What would you suggest?" "Oh, I like all the stuff you aren't supposed to eat too much of." Her face lit with a smile. "Pancakes make me fat, but they're probably my favorite. I always have a big stack on my birthday." "About that high," she giggled and held her hand midway in the air. "And then, of course, I always eat lots of cake, too, including a big piece right before I go to bed." "What else do you like?" "I really like the hash browns. The way they make them back there. Well, they're delicious with a capital D. Our cook is from Sweden, and he makes them just like his mum used to, shredded and fat. Plus, we use butter, not oil, and we can mix cheese and such inside them if you'd like. I never eat them because they're probably even worse for me than the pancakes. But you're skinny. I'd definitely order them if I was you." "If I order them, you can have a bite," Zach said, then waited to see if the waitress wanted to play. She blushed, then half glanced back toward the kitchen. "I don't think they'd like that very much. I'll probably get in trouble." "I won't let them see." "The kitchen's real busy today," she said. "What can I get you?" Though her voice was all business, her smile hadn't faded. Well, in that case, Zach took a final glance at the menu, just for grins. "I think I'll have an order of pancakes." This tall, he held his hand midway in the air and smiled. "And I'd also like an order of those hash browns you were talking about, and a side of whatever kind of meat you would want to eat, if you weren't trying to keep your girlish figure even more girlish." "You want any cheese or anything else in your potatoes?" "What are my choices?" Anything that comes in an omelette, we can put it in the potatoes. Plain is fine. Actually, he added, can I get some grilled onions? Sure thing, she said. Her face danced as she repeated his order. You want a tall stack of Vermont, an order of hash, make 'em cry, and a side of Zeppelin. Sounds good to me. Anything else I can get you? Your name, if it's not too much. Your uniforms don't have the little name tag thingy on them. Zach tapped the spot on his chest where a name tag would go, then gave the waitress a playful shrug. She looked at her chest, almost surprised to see he was right. Amy. Thanks, Amy. I'm Zach. Hi, Zach. Nice to meet you. Anything else? Just one more thing. Or two, I guess, if you can spare an extra minute. He smiled again, his biggest one yet. Amy feigned impatience, then said, Yes? Can you tell me where the nearest gas station is? Of course, just a mile down the road that way. Amy jerked her thumb behind her, the direction Zach was heading after he left. Next? I didn't see any newspaper stands on my way in here, and since the only thing I have to keep myself entertained is the show over there, he said, nodding at the makeout couple. I thought maybe I'd read the news while I was waiting. My phone is so close to dead, I don't even want to check for a signal. Is there a paper machine around here? Or maybe someone left something behind I could read? I'll take anything, really. I'm not picky. Amy was baffled. She shook her head slowly, as if she'd never heard of a newspaper. No, she said. We don't have anything like that. Your order will be up in just a few minutes, okay? She gave Zach a final smile, the thinnest so far, then headed toward the kitchen. Zach shook his head. He knew he was in the sticks, but hell, even rubes had newspapers. He hoped Amy didn't think he was silently judging her or her restaurant, though he was. It wasn't her fault she was stuck in this time trap. Poor thing would probably be happy to get out of Dodge as soon as she could, just never been offered the chance. Times like this, he wondered if he'd be better off finding someone else, someone who appreciated him more. A girl like Amy, in a place like this, would probably be grateful to a guy like him getting her the hell out of here. It had been a while since he'd done anything more than flirt harmlessly with a girl, but he was pretty certain he could still work the dimples his mother had blessed him with, and his father had taught him how to use so effectively. Yet even with the light banter, he still felt a twinge of guilt, as if he were somehow being unfaithful to Molly. As he scanned the diner, he realized that nobody was reading anything. Not a book, nor a paper, nor even a magazine. Shit. He thought of the old Bill Hicks stand-up routine where the comedian said he was in a Waffle House in Tennessee alone and reading a book. A waitress came up to him and asked, "What you reading for?" Not what he was reading, but what he was reading for, as if nobody would do it unless required. At which point, a trucker stood up and said in a hillbilly drawl, "Well, we got ourselves a reader." The idea that some place out in the middle of nowhere didn't get the daily news was beyond weird. They have to get regular shipments of food, right? The fact that there wasn't a single paper in the entire diner and the waitress didn't even seem to know what a paper was felt downright troubling, and the thought was growing more bothersome by the second. Zach started to look around, really look, not at what he expected to see, which is how most everyone looks at the world, but at what was actually there. The diner was new, but old too. He couldn't explain it any better than that. But he knew it to be true. The air didn't match the paint, and everything seemed antiquated, not just the clocks, but also the people. Zach wanted to see if Molly had called again, but he noticed with a flutter of panic that his phone was missing. Where his Nokia touchscreen had been sitting just moments before was now a beige leather coin purse which he'd never seen before. Zach twisted the latch and looked inside. A single $10 bill, a few fives and couple of ones. Also, a whole mess of small shredded slips of paper. Phone numbers, addresses, to-dos. He pulled out 2 slips of paper, Johnny Brownson's phone number, and a note to tell Adrian about the Guitar Center thing. What the? A note I'd written in my phone, along with a contact also from my phone. He pulled out more slips and more of the same. Someone is fucking with me. Anyone see my phone? Zach called out to the restaurant. Silence. A few looks, as if nobody wanted to acknowledge him. As if they were almost afraid to. Zach stared at Oatmeal Man. The man stared back, then winked. Zach marched over and said, "You seen my phone?" Oatmeal Man said, "You're a bit close. I can smell the nothing you've had to eat all day on your breath." Zack took a step back, twice as angry. "What did you do with my phone, man?" "I have no idea what you're talking about." "I think you do." Oatmeal Man smiled, making Zack want to punch him, then said, "Maybe you left it in your car," and glanced out the window in a way that made Zack want to punch him harder. Zack followed his gaze, which should have bull's-eyed his yellow Xterra, but his car was gone. In its place was a late 60s green Ford pickup. Zack's head began to pound as his growing uneasiness threatened to send him into a panic attack. It had been a long time since he'd had one, but could feel the symptoms coming on. He turned to Oatmeal Man, demanding answers. "The hell are you playing at, old man? Where's my fucking car?" "I'm not playing at a thing," the man said, and put a spoonful of oatmeal in his mouth. He dipped his spoon into the oatmeal for another bite. "Maybe you should sit down and relax a bit. You're making a scene." Zack stared, seething, then looked around the diner. Everyone was staring at him as if he'd grown a second head. He considered running outside to find his car, but he needed to sit, calm down, collect his thoughts, or he would pass out like he'd done too many times before. He returned to his booth, legs shaky. Amy had refilled his water, which he downed in several large gulps. He wiped his lips on the back of a napkin and felt the eyes behind him. Zack turned, and sure enough, Oatmeal Man was slowly spinning his spoon around the edge of his bowl, pretending not to look at Zack about as much as he was trying not to look crazy. Zack turned back around. Everyone else had returned to business as usual, as if he'd never drawn all their attention with his outburst. What the hell is wrong with these people? The couple had stopped their fighting and had returned to face grazing, though all four of their hands had disappeared beneath the table. Zack leaned back in his seat, straining to hear more conversation from the old couple behind him. "Bah," the man said. "India has an A-bomb and bikinis have turned to string. The world is going to shit so fast it's hard to keep track." He wanted to run, but could only draw a labored breath. "Mind if I sit?" Zack felt Oatmeal Man's movement behind him before he saw him, pointing at the empty seat across from him. Zack nodded. Though his first impulse was anger at the man, there was something relaxing in the man's demeanor that calmed Zack a bit. Oatmeal Man sat and raised his hand, seeking Amy's attention. Amy was at the table a second later, setting a cup of coffee in front of Zack. "I know you didn't order it," Amy said, "but I thought you might like a cup. You don't have to pay, it's on the house. Do you need cream or sugar?" "No, thank you," Zack said as he slid the coffee closer and inhaled the slightly bitter yet comforting scent. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" Amy turned to Oatmeal Man. "I'd like one of those too," he said, pointing at Zack's coffee. "Sure thing. I'll be back in a minute with that." She turned back to Zack. "And your food will be up in just a few." She disappeared, and the two men sat in silence. When Amy returned 2 minutes later with the Oatmeal Man's cup of coffee and Zack's heavy order of fats and starches, the two men still hadn't traded a single word. "You have any salsa?" Amy went blank. "You know, for the hash browns." "You mean Tabasco?" Amy said. "We have that. It's on the table next to you." She pointed at the caddy filled with ketchup, Tabasco, and something green. He noticed that while the caddy had a glass jar with sugar, there wasn't an artificial sweetener packet to be found. "Thanks, that will be great," Zack said, tasting a memory. Amy left, and Zack leaned forward. "What is it you want?" "Just trying to figure you out," the Oatmeal Man said, taking a long sip of his coffee. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "Like I said, just trying to figure you out. No more, no less." "You think maybe you could try and figure me out over in your own space, or do you have to figure me out while I'm having a meal?" Zack had been locked on Oatmeal Man's eyes, but turned his attention to his plate and started cutting his meat. Oatmeal Man said nothing, just sipped his coffee and kept looking at Zack. It was maybe 2 minutes before Zack decided he couldn't take it any longer, then swallowed his pancake and said, "So, what makes me so interesting?" Oatmeal Man didn't miss a beat. "You're the only one in here who looks the least bit surprised." "What do you mean by that?" "I'm not speaking in code," the man said as he stroked his skunk-striped beard. "I mean exactly what I said. You're the only one in here who looks surprised. Go ahead, look around. Everyone's going about their day, fixed on whatever they're doing, eating their food, holding up their part of a conversation or letting their eyes wander around. Whatever they're doing, they're present. You are not. You're a cat, whiskers twitching, itchy in your skin, and baffled by the world around you. Oatmeal Man smiled at Zach, his eyes lighting up as if he'd just discovered a secret. Does that sound about right? Zach studied the old man, then leaned forward. Can you tell me what's happening here? It felt like forever before Oatmeal Man was finally ready to speak, and when he finally seemed like he was, he didn't. He shook his head, took another sip of coffee, then swallowed. Another 30 seconds later, he said, "No, but I have an idea." Another long minute of silence until Zach severed it. Well? That phone you were talking about, that fit in your pocket, right? Small as a coin purse, maybe. Zach stared across the table. Even if the crazy man had taken his phone, there was no way he had time to write down the notes and numbers in his phone onto scraps of paper. And you were going to use it to call Molly, to say you're sorry, right? Zach didn't know what to think, but he suppressed his sudden urgency to beat the man silly. How do you know Molly's name? He asked. Not sure, Oatmeal Man shook his head. Wish I knew. I just know stuff. And just so you don't think I'm crazy, or so you know I'm the right kind of crazy at least, I'll tell you the stuff I know always ends up being right. I'll prove it by telling you about the glass that's gonna shatter yonder in about 10 seconds. Oatmeal Man pointed toward the kitchen, and sure enough, after 10 seconds, the sound of glass shattering was followed by an argument. How did you do that? The man shrugged. I have no idea. I just know stuff. You going to get all mystical and shit? Or can you just get to the part of the movie with all the bullets? Zach kept his eyes fixed on Oatmeal Man, then filled his mouth with hash browns, lightly drizzled in Tabasco. What do you know? I'm not your enemy. What did you say your name was? I'm Dennis. I'm Zach. It's good to meet you, Zach. Dennis's face went warm. He took a sip of coffee, then cleared his throat. What if I told you this diner was stuck, and so are we? Stuck? Dennis settled into another lingering silence, then said, Let me say that a different way. I think you're stuck, but really I have no idea. Just a theory or something I maybe remember. He took another sip of coffee. I think sometimes time gets stuck, like a record skipping. No, he shook his head. That's not quite right. More like a battery dying. A slice of time gets tired, so it sits around doing nothing. Zach stared. Dennis continued. So what if time was like a neon sign, and just one letter of the sign was flickering, burning out, but all the other letters were working fine? You see what I mean? Zach started to nod and then said, No. I can't explain it, but for the last hour, since 40 minutes or so before you walked in, this whole diner felt different, and everything suddenly seemed familiar. No, he shook his head. Not just familiar, more like habit or pattern or routine. Not sure of the right word. Don't even know if the right word exists. Since that moment, I've felt like I was on the edge of remembering something, right at the border of a really, really big idea. An idea I felt like I'd already figured out before, maybe 1,000,000 times. Every second I've been sitting in this diner since that first moment has felt like I was swimming in déjà vu. Until now, until I started talking to you, this whole conversation feels like something new. Zach opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but words failed him. Dennis kept going. I knew it from the second you came in. You didn't belong, and you knew it too. Look around and you'll see it clear. Everyone is stuck in sort of a time snap. And you know the worst part? Dennis leaned forward, eyes narrowed in fear. I think these people all came in here at one point in time or another, 1 year or another, just like you and me. I think I was the last one in. I can't even remember what year it is. I think I figured it out too late, and now I'm forgetting everything about who I was and where I came from. All I know is what I see, the right here and now. When I try to think back further, everything gets hazy. What year is it? 2011, Zach said, looking again around the diner. The music, the clothes, everything was stuck in the past. Were the diners also? What year did you come in here? Dennis started to answer, then couldn't. I can't remember, but 2011 seems so far from my present. As realization sunk into Zach's head, his eyes widened. You see it now. Dennis nodded. Don't get stuck here. Don't let it. Get out of here now while you still can, before you forget. Can I get you gentlemen anything else? Amy said, suddenly appearing at their table, refilling their nearly empty cups. Zach looked up, caught her eye, and felt a bottomless longing for Molly. No thank you, Zach shook his head. Just the check when you can. Sure thing. Amy pulled the check from her apron and set it on the table. No charge on the coffee, and I even threw your friends in. We're brewing it by the bucket back there. She turned and went to see if the couple in the booth across from them was finally ready to order. Zach returned his attention to Dennis. How do I go, and how do I know if I can? I say you drive. Just go and go now, as fast and as far as you can. Zach leaned forward and whispered, Hey, why don't you come with me? I'd be happy to drive. You can get out of this place too. Thank you, Dennis said, but it's not possible. I just remembered. I already tried. As soon as I figured it out, or thought or remembered, I'm not quite sure, I tried to get out of here. Didn't even get halfway to my car, that old Cutlass out there, which is not the car I came in with. As soon as I left the diner, Dennis shook his head, as if experiencing the memory for the first time. It was the worst thing you could ever imagine, everywhere in my body. Like pain? No, pain would have been better than this. There's no way to describe the feeling of no longer being there, the molecules that make you whole evaporating one by one as you feel yourself slowly starting to no longer exist. But with every step I took backward, the feeling of being flooded back into my body. No, I'm stuck here, Zach. You're not. At least I don't believe you are. I think you can leave this diner, get in your car, and just leave. And I think you should go as soon as possible, because to stay too long, I believe, is to stay forever. Dennis sounded insane, like someone who had dropped a bit too much acid, but his words seemed genuine. So what does the rest of your day look like? Zach asked. What happens next for you and everyone else in here? I don't know. I have flashes of memory, but nothing I can quite sort out. Dennis smiled, but only barely. Zach stood from the table and held his hand out. Thanks, man. I wish I had more to say or do. Just go, Dennis said, while you still can. Zach dug into his coin purse and fished out a reasonably new-looking $5 bill, checking the date out of curiosity. 1968. He dropped the $5 on the table, then gave Dennis a final nod before slipping from the booth, crossing the diner, and stepping outside into the crisp, cool day. Zach was terrified he would start turning to nothing, just like Dennis described. But every step made him feel stronger, and he was fat with relief by the time he climbed inside and closed the door of the pickup, which had been an Xterra. He revved the engine, and Don McLean's American Pie blared through the speakers. He backed out, tires spitting gravel as he roared onto the highway, pushing the pedal as far as it would go. I'm coming home, Molly, and I'm never leaving again. Sure enough, a mile down the highway, there was an old-fashioned gas station, which up close didn't look too old at all. He pulled in, got full service, and left a generous tip with a smile on his face. Zach was another 5 miles down the road when he realized the pickup had turned back into his Xterra. There wasn't any noticeable mutation. The dashboard just suddenly looked brighter and a lot more crowded. Then there was a second of silence, and Slim Shady was back, telling Zach what his name was. Zach reached in his pocket, feeling for and finding his phone. He cheered out loud, filling the cabin with his victory. He looked at the screen, which was dead. He'd pull over at the next stop, hope for a phone booth and call Molly, tell her everything that had happened, then race back home. But what should I tell her? There was no way she would possibly believe him. Hell, who would? He was pretty sure he wouldn't believe her if she told him the same story. Impossible was impossible, and there wasn't any way love could twist fiction into fact. He may as well keep the shit to himself, focus on the happy reunion. He'd even be the one to say sorry again. Who cares, I'm back. As Zach replayed the events in his head, he realized how ludicrous his story would sound if ever repeated out loud. He began to doubt it himself. And after a mile or two, his subconscious started talking him into thinking maybe the whole thing was a bit of fiction after all. Just a crazy conversation with a confused old man. Or, and this seemed the more likely reason, maybe he'd grown sleepy, pulled to the side of the road, and simply fallen into the thick of a dream. Zack tore down the highway, fingers wrapped around the steering wheel of his Xterra, when he saw the faded diner sign, which read, Al's Moonlight Diner. Your dining destination, 10 miles ahead. The sign was half covered in creeping vegetation, and Zack wondered if the diner was still standing. He was famished, his head was pounding, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten.